Welcome to CRG's first online course titled Reading Refugees, Reading Migration, an online orientation course for college and university teachers. My name is Shamota. I will be corresponding with you and taking care of this course mostly. I now invite Professor Shobhoshachi Bosurai Chaudhuri, who is the honorary director of the Calcutta Research Group, which is organizing this program, to say a few words about CRG and about the program. Professor Boshurai Chaudhuri, apart from being our honorary director, also teaches political science at Rabindra Bharati University. Shobhoshachi.
Good evening, everybody, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to this inaugural session of the first online teachers workshop on reading refugees, reading migration. Now, before we course this workshop, let me just familiarize you. Some of you know already, some of you may not know about the Calcutta Research Group or CRG, which is geographically located in Kolkata, India, eastern part of India, but it is spread all over the country as well as all over South Asia in particular, with partners in different parts of India, different parts of South Asia, as well as in different parts of the world. So Calcutta Research Group, or CRG as it is referred to, it was set up 25 years back, around 1996. And a few academics, media persons, human rights activists, and civil rights workers, all of them, they came together, and they came together through, evening chats over tea and snacks. And they decided at some point of time that beyond the university system, there should be something that all these people, these academics, these media persons, the human rights activists, and so on, they can or they could do. And they decided really to work on some of the issues, particularly on human rights, but also on refugee and migration studies, on citizenship, on democracy, on autonomy. And basically, when it was decided that it would concentrate, CRG would concentrate on the refugee and migration studies. In fact, many people, particularly from South Asia, they would have preferred to join the Oxford Refugee Studies program at some point of time, who were working in this area. They were interested to join that course. But unfortunately, many of them could not afford and could not really make it for several reasons. And therefore, this particular course, that course CRG has been organizing for a long time, I'll explain that, on forced migration. This course, in the initial phase, it continued for 12 consecutive years. And now, again, when it was being conducted in the initial stage, it was a 2-week course, basically 2-week residential course. And later on, when after 12 consecutive years, when we started reviewing our course with all kinds of feedback from the participants, we decided that it would be, change the format, and maybe we would be learning more. And it was after a brief pause, it was decided that we would change the format, and this would be a shortened kind of course. So now this will be the 6th year in this phase, and this course this year would be in November, this workshop. So this would be the 6th in a row. So after 12 years with a pause, now 6 years again, after completing 5 years. So this has been a flagship program, not only of the Calcutta Research Group, but also a major flagship program, this course, which has been a great success of, the forced migration studies in entire South Asia. So we can see that from this course, people have been taking back many ideas and also plowing back many ideas to these workshops, to other programs of the Calcutta Research Group. And basically, as I would say, that Calcutta Research Group, while working on forced migration studies, working on refugees and migration, it has been concentrating more on South Asia in particular and the global South in general. So this is what Calcutta Research Group does. And as I said at the outset, that this is a new program. This is an online teachers workshop program. All of the participants, as we know, they are teaching in some colleges or universities or other academic institutions. So it is a give and take process. It is not only a monologue by the resource persons who would be speaking on different aspects, on different dimensions of the refugee issue or the issue of migration, but we would also be learning, we would also be learning from your own experiences, experiences from your fieldwork, experiences from what you have been doing in these areas. So we would be beginning this first teachers workshop, which is online this year because of the pandemic situation, all you know. And this would be, read on reading refugees and reading migration, an orientation program or orientation workshop meant for mainly the college and university teachers. As we know that there would be, this would be a 7-week program, and every week on Saturdays and Sundays in the evenings, we would have these interactions, and these resource persons would be from all over the country as well as from different parts of the world. So this is not only going to be, an interaction with only the South Asian participants. There would be others as well. So in this case, as we know that this year already as the course coordinator, she would be explaining more, Dr. Shamata Bishwas. She has already informed us that already we have 37 participants, 37 teachers from different disciplinary backgrounds and from different parts of the country, as well as from different other countries as well. As I said, it would be a 7-week interaction. As I said at the outset, more would be, explained to you by course coordinator Shamata, my colleague. But before that, let me also say that the inaugural lecture today would be delivered by Professor Lydia Potts, and she will be introduced by Shamata, the course coordinator. And Lydia teaches at the Karl von Ossietzky University at Oldenburg, Germany. So I, once again, on behalf of the Calcutta Research Group, and on my behalf as the honorary director of the Calcutta Research Group, I welcome all of you. And I also welcome Lydia to this workshop. So it is over to Shamata to say more about logistics, more about the workshop, and also kindly introduce Lydia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shobhosachita. Once again, welcome everybody to this online orientation course for college and university teachers. Before I introduce Professor Lydia Potts, just two things that I have to say. One, after Professor Potts' lecture, we will have a very short interaction session, a question and answer session. If you have questions or comments, you're free to uh, ask them to directly to Professor Potts or to leave your questions in the chat box, and one of us will read them out to her. We will spend about 10 minutes in the question answer session after Professor's lecture, and then we will have a short getting to know each other session. So here in this meeting, we both have all the 37 participants who have been selected to the course. We have some of the resource persons. We have some senior CRG members who are, some of whom are also resource persons, and we have the team which has been working towards making this course happen. So some of them are CRG researchers, some of them are like me, or Shucharita, who is the course assistant, CRG members. So we will try to get to know each other at the end of the lecture. So I'm very, very happy to introduce Professor Lydia Potts, who will be delivering the inaugural lecture today. Professor Potts, as Shobhushachita said, teaches at Karl von Ossietzky University at Oldenburg, Germany. She's the coordinator of the working group on migration, gender, and politics there. She's also a teacher of migration studies at Oldenburg. Professor Potts is the associate member of the Center for Migration, Education, and Cultural Studies. Calcutta Research Group has had a very long connection with Professor Lydia Potts. Professor has been regularly visiting Calcutta and Calcutta Research Group, participating in the series of workshops and conferences that we have been holding for several years now. Similarly, many of the senior CRG members and researchers regularly interact and coordinate with her, and they also often take turns to teach at various programs that she organizes. But what made us certain and what made us all agree that Professor Potts would be the perfect person to deliver the inaugural lecture, that is the fact that she is also the coordinator of the Erasmus Mundus master's course, EMIR, which is European Masters in Migration and Intercultural Relations. So that kind of explains to us why we are all here to listen to Professor Lydia Potts. So thank you once again, Professor, for agreeing to deliver the inaugural address, and welcome.
It's really a pleasure and an honor to deliver this inaugural lecture. And I spent quite a bit of time thinking what to tell you, as this is the first lecture in a series. And I do think you are all at the start of something that might lead to quite a few activities. So I thought of entitling my lecture Reading Migration. I didn't really feel safe to also say Reading Refugees, as I'm not so much going into that dimension, but there is also some of that, and reading migration in this sense also includes forced migration. So I would like to start with three brief stories of migration, and from there move on to very briefly, very sketchily talk about contemporary theories of migration. And then I'd like to go to what I may consider my specialty, a longue durée perspective of colonialism, labor, and the post-colonial world, as I do think that we need historical perspectives to understand a contemporary migration. After that, I would like to do a little bit, just a little bit, in the direction of deconstructing dominant perspectives about global migration. And then I would like to come back to my three stories from the beginning. What lessons do we learn from these stories? And in the end, I would like, as a Northerner, talk about perspectives from the global South. And my claim is that we are in dire need of such perspectives. I'm very much aware that the Calcutta Research Group is contributing such perspectives, but I would argue we need many more of these. So why do people migrate? So my first story is from Turkey at the border to Syria. In 1969, Kadriye and her 4-year-old son Ugur joined the husband and father, who is a migrant worker in Germany. After the 1968 recession, when about 700,000 migrants from Germany had been sent home within months, those with stable jobs now get their work permits extended. The German employers have realized that the rotation scheme used so far is uneconomic. And in many cases, it is the wives who had for years lived separated from their husbands who now insist that the families should be united in the country of migration. Ugur's father works in the Ford automobile factory in Bochum in the Ruhr area. The boy attends the elementary school and has very good grades. Like very many migrants, Ugur has high educational aspirations. He dreams of becoming a medical doctor. But what happens to many migrant children, especially to boys, also happens to him. Even with his excellent grades, the teachers do not recommend him for the gymnasium, the school that prepares for academic careers. This one is from Rwanda. Beata's parents, a Congolese father from the DRC and a Rwandan mother, are both killed in the Rwandan genocide. With her siblings, she flees to the DRC, where a relative takes care of them. In the course of the First Congo War, the family flees again to the west of the country. During the Second Congo War, they are again internally displaced. Her brother is handed over to the militias, and her older sister disappears within the context of a disordered European rescue operation. For 2 years, Beata and her young sister remain in the IDP camp, where she is continuously raped at the age of 13. Then Beata and her sister flee to Tanzania, where she gives birth to a daughter with a chronic illness and herself is diagnosed as HIV positive. Meanwhile, she learns that her older sister is living in Germany. She applies for political asylum and eventually arrives in Germany. This one is an African story from Phoenix, which is near Bas in the Gambia. In December 2016, 13 male youths leave Phoenix in Bas, Gambia, disintegrating its powerful and promising football club. They take a journey to Europe. Of these 13 people, 7 reach the Italian shores. 6 die in the sea. Among them, 2 are from the same compound and the same parents. This shocks the whole community, especially the most affected household. This story is from an EMIA graduate, Omar Jallo, and he spoke to Apama, one of the family members of the 2 brothers, and he confirms their loss. He said they left just after they played the football finals, and they sent him goodbye messages expressing hope for improvement in their condition if they make it to Europe, and seeking for his prayers and sympathy if the journey turns dark. So please keep these stories a bit in mind while we now continue to look at theories, history, data. As reading migration is about what we might call real people, it is about lived experiences, we will eventually get back to the stories. So I was wondering for quite some time how I would include migration theory in this presentation, because I do think migration theories are key if we want to read migration. And there is an interesting European Commission website that quite aptly summarizes migration theory. So if you want to have a look at what is the key structures of migration theory, it's not a bad idea to go to this website. There are a number of academic texts summarizing and critiquing migration theories by authors like Joaquim Arango, Russell King, or Stephen Castles. And in addition to that, we have the EU website that also gives some sources. So here is a look at some of the key theories. So we start with the neoclassical approaches and over new economics and dual or segmented labor market, it becomes quite clear that economics is a key in quite a bit of migration studies. And then we have sociology and political science, especially with the migration systems and networks approach or with the institutional approach. Yeah, the EU also points out that policy plays an important role in migration, in what one might call migration theory. And I find this quite interesting and telling, as I will get to that a bit later, as a lot of migration theory is rather close to policy. And so this in a way confirms that. Another migration theory the EU is referring to is the world systems approach. And if you look at this little blurb that they provide us with, it sort of does away with what I think is a key dimension of the world systems approach, that it has a historical perspective. So overall, so in a way, you can start, if you would want to get an overview, what are contemporary migration theories, this website provides some guidance. And I would like to now just summarize a few thoughts that are widely shared regarding migration theory. So the first thought is that to develop grand theory is not a feasible aim of migration theory, as the phenomena are too complex and diverse. Mid-range theories are more appropriate. Then there's also quite an understanding that interdisciplinary approaches are most productive. In many cases, that means the combination of several of those theories that were just listed and a few other ones. I think it was also comparatively clear that the theories listed were rather disciplinary oriented. Yeah, and what I've already mentioned, overall, the field of migration theory or migration studies also is quite policy driven, meaning the closeness to policy advice limits the development of theoretical perspectives. Recommendations that we can also comparatively frequently hear is, in order to further develop migration theory, it would be useful to draw on general social theory approaches and to take it from there. So not to aim at having a specific corner for migration theory, but rather embed migration theory in the wider horizons of social theory. I do think that that is an important thought, and there is quite a bit of very relevant studies that illustrate this. What I would like to point out is that migration theory also needs foundations in migration history. That is what I felt the EU website completely blends out. And with this in regard to migration history, my argument would be that the historical perspective chosen is key for theory development. And I don't have the time today to look into the various approaches we have in migration theory. Three migration historians, Dirk Hörder, Christiane Harzig, and Donna Gabaccia, have this very impressive little sentence: the history of humanity is a history of migration. So this sort of highlights the importance of a historical perspective when we look at migration. And this also highlights that we very often have what one might call a sedentary bias. So in many conversations, but also in academic contexts, there is sort of an often not really discussed understanding that people are sedentary, and that it is an exception, that it is something special, that it is a problem if people migrate. And so I think this sentence sort of turns this from the feet to its head by pointing out the history of humanity is a history of migration. Now, we have various approaches to migration history, and I do think that when we look at migration history, it is very important to look at the power relations at work in the context of migration history. And on that basis, I would like to highlight that long before the globalization of the late 20th and the early 21st century, a world labor market emerged through European expansion and colonialism. European colonialism is actually very much about labor, because colonialism, with the aim to enrich the so-called motherland, to enrich the colonizing powers, wouldn't work without the people that produce, that transport, that handle all the goods that the colonizers want. So the appropriation and the subsequent production of goods, from precious metals and stones to sugarcane, cotton, rubber, and there would be a very long list of such products. All this needs huge numbers of workers. And throughout colonial history, almost none of these workers came with the colonizing powers. Almost none of these were white or European people. So it was the people at home in the colonized regions that were used as labor force. And all colonial regimes establish systems of forced labor and of means to control the labor force. A major tool to control the labor force is migration. Because when you force a person to migrate, and we have to also think about the conditions of the 16th, 17th, 18th century, when there is almost no infrastructure, when even a travel of something like 30 or 50 kilometers is a major undertaking and leads to also people living in an area that they are not known, where they have no connections and all that. So a lot of the colonial labor is migrant labor, forced migrant labor, for means of control, but also because very often the goods that the colonizers wanted were not necessarily where the workers were. So, for example, in the silver mines of Latin America, or the rubber plantations in the Congo, all this was not necessarily where the people were living. And so colonizers used force to make people go to these areas. And throughout the colonial history, not unfrequently, a gradual transition from forced to some form of wage labor took place within the system. So people would get small amounts of money, but they would still be forced to do this work via various means, physical violence, but also a very frequent tool was tax labor. So people were forced to pay taxes, and in order to be able to pay the taxes, they would have to work. So what I'm trying to point out here is that the establishment of the world labor market, meaning really workers, forced laborers being mobile globally, is preceding industrialization, and it is also one of the key features, the key foundations of industrialization. So the colonial world labor market is first of all about the global mobilization of labor. And I'm talking here tens of millions and even to some extent hundreds of millions of people who were, if we add it up, we easily reach more than 100 million people who were mobilized that way. And this colonial world labor market led to the redistribution of considerable parts of the world's population across the globe. As you are based in India and you know where all the Indian communities are, I do think you know better than I do how this did work. And my overall point is that this historical world labor market constitutes a major element in the shaping of contemporary economies and societies. In a way, just as a little reminder, there were four major periods of the development of the world labor market. First of all, when the colonizers arrived in what was later called Latin America, they forced the people there to work for them, and this led to an absolute destruction of the population there. Only 1 in 8 or 1 in 9 persons survived European colonization. This was not exclusively due to the forced labor, but forced labor was a major dimension in this. So in the 17th century, Latin America was to quite an extent depopulated. And but there were all these riches to be had for European colonization. The plantation economy had started. There were huge mines, infrastructure projects were going on, and so on. So that was the time when, in order to replace the laborers, slavery, the transatlantic system of slavery started, and African workers were brought to the Americas, not only to Latin America, but also to North America. And here we have to think about something like 12 to 15 million people who actually arrived as slaves in the Americas. That's the estimates. And quite a few scholars argue that about 100 million people were affected by this because the slave hunts in Africa killed a lot of people and destroyed communities. Also, when the people had to were sort of warehoused before the departure on the slave ships, a lot of them died, and a lot of them died along the route and were just thrown into the oceans. So we are talking here about dimensions somewhere between 15 and 100 million people. As a result of the colonization of Asia and the economic destruction connected to that, there was large supplies of labor. And in 1820, the Asian indentured labor system, or contract labor, or sometimes also called coolie labor, started. And Hugh Tinker, a British historian, his book about this is called A New System of Slavery. So technically speaking, this was wage labor. It was, and there were contracts on all that, but the conditions under which these workers migrated and worked were very harsh, and so it was not so much different from slavery But not to forget, technically speaking here, we are talking of wage labor. Asian indentured and contract laborers were not only brought to the Americas, they were also used in various other parts of Asia, in Australia, and also in Africa, not to forget, when we look at the conflicts going on in South Africa right now. They are also, to some extent, the anti-Indian activities currently going on. Indians also came to South Africa via the indentured labor and contract labor system. Just as an illustration how these developments still influence what is going on currently. And then last but not least, Asia was the last continent to be colonized. And all colonizing powers, but I really did a proper counting for each colony, did use forced labor. So this map summarizes what I've just been describing and shows that it was actually a global structure we are talking about. And what is just two concluding thoughts on this: the mobilization of labor throughout the colonial period, and colonial period means well into the 20th century, did not end with the end of the colonial period, because the dynamics that had started and also the impoverishment of the colonized people continued this process. So it became sort of self-feeding. And another important dimension, while during the colonial period, migration by the colonized took primarily place by migration from one colony to another, only in the aftermath, Europe and North America also became major destinations. And I'd like to, in a way, say, and that is what Europe complains about, the global North complains about. So during the colonial era, the powers were strong enough to direct the streams of laborers just where the global North wanted them. So this was sort of a, I think, rather long venture into colonial labor history. And and I'm presenting this to you as I do think that when we look at contemporary migration, when we try to analyze and explain contemporary migration, also when we look at migration policy, we should have an awareness of what are historical dimensions, what elements here are actually late outcomes of this. So now I'm switching to contemporary migration. And as I have to be very brief, I have to keep it somewhat sketchy. And I thought it might make sense to start with looking at how many migrants are there globally. And the latest numbers I could find is that there is about 280 million migrants globally, which is about 3.6% of the world's population, of the 7.8 billion people living. And 280 million people, on one hand, is a considerable number. That is also, I think, something that makes it important, and so on, that we look at it, that we try to theorize and conceptualize it, that we engage with it. But on the other hand, I do think, and that's for you to evaluate, what we can say is that the number of migrants globally is comparatively stable. It is somewhere around 3% of the global population for decades. And then compared to the overall population of the globe, it is a comparatively small proportion of the world's population. Um, Another dimension that I think we should be aware of, very often the general thinking is that global migration is about migration to the global north. There's lots of maps around where we have arrows and so on, and they are all pointing, well, not all, but predominantly pointing to Europe, to North America, and then maybe to some extent to the oil exporting countries. But what is really important that when we look at contemporary migration is that we realize how multi-directional it is. And that means, among others, two things. Many countries are both countries of immigration and countries of emigration. There is an interesting website, People Moving, that illustrates that in a graphical way, so that really most of the countries on the globe are nowadays countries of immigration and countries of emigration. And the other dimension is, sure, there is migration movements to the global north, but South-South migration is also important, and South-South migration is what is specifically growing. Before we come to this colorful image, I would like to point out that it is also rather important to understand that global migration is primarily regional. That means it happens within world regions. So if we look at the overall structure of global migration, this is not so much about transcontinental migration, it is rather about migration to neighboring countries. And now let's look at the next slide, colorful graph. This is by Guy Abel. You can, the source is on the slide. You can find it on his website. You can also find the very complex statistical papers that are the basis for this, which I find very interesting graph. It was first published in 2014 in Science, and Guy Abel also developed it further for the period from 2015 to 2020, which you see here. And so here the arrows, the thicker they are, the more people are behind it. And you can see there's a few thick lines that go across continents. So for example, from South Asia to North America, I think that is the strongest one. There is on my screen, there is a pink one that doesn't belong here. So this is just the disk shifted so that we have Asia on top and can have a good look at the Asian dimension. But overall, this applies to each continent, that migration is happening from one region to another in the same continent, or sometimes the neighboring continent. So global migration is not primarily migration to the global north, is not primarily transcontinental migration, but regional. Next. This is the graph that we've been looking at, translated into a map. And I think it's also a very recent map by UNDISA from January 21. So this, I think, illustrates in a very interesting way that global migration is actually happening globally, happening basically everywhere. And very importantly, I do think that we can see on this map that African migration is primarily migration within Africa. And that brings me back to this migration theory website that had this, you might later have another look at the presentation. Interestingly, the EU Commission decided to have this graph in the middle of the website where they tell us that 15 million migrants from within the EU are in Europe, and 19 or almost 20 million from third countries. And I would like to alert you to this, that these 19.8 million people are coming from, I guess, 4 different continents. So that actually, yes, in the EU, the largest group of migrants, if we go by origin, is migrants from within the EU. So in a way, confirming what we have been looking at in the graph and in the map. Although I do think that the aim or the message behind the website is a rather different one. Yeah, and so we've been talking about migrants when we were looking at the graphs and the maps. And if we look at refugees, there's this a little bit older map from 2015 that shows that about 80% of the world refugees are living in the global south. So only less than 20% of the world's refugees make it to the global north. Next slide. Yeah. So, and this proportion since 2015 has even risen. The latest number is that 86% of the global refugees are hosted in developing countries. And this other graph, 4 of the 5 major hosting countries of refugees are countries in the global south. So we go back to the stories now, but before I would really like to summarize this. So when we look at contemporary migration, we should focus on what is going on in the global south, and we need to understand global migration primarily from that perspective, although very much of the scholarship is based in the global north and is also addressing the global north. So let me now go back to my 3 stories. So the first one from Turkey. In Ugur's case, as in many others, a neighbor intervened when he did not get the recommendation for the advanced school. So discriminatory structures, sometimes at least, were opposed by neighbors, by other teachers, relatives, and so on. And then the boy was sent to the gymnasium, which he completed with outstanding grades, and then went on to medical school. In other words, against all odds for migrant young men in Germany and the structural discrimination, Ugur realized his early aspirations and became a very successful second-generation migrant. Because what I've been using here was what is known about Ugur Shahin's biography, and he and his wife, Özlem Türeci, developed the corona vaccine BioNTech. And I don't know if you can see that on your screen. The Deutsche Welle publishes this portrait correctly with the info German researchers advanced coronavirus vaccine. So this is a success story. For Beata, unfortunately, there's not really a success story. Although she and her daughter now live in Germany for several years, and they are not near her sister, and they receive adequate health care, but Beata's claim for asylum is turned down. The plane she had thought would bring her to Germany had landed in another EU country, and according to the EU regulations, she should have claimed asylum there. Her status now, she lives with a Duldung, which is a permission to remain until deported. The story from Phoenix in Gambia. While the household is mourning the two lost young men, the only young male left in this home also ventures on the irregular journey. Just 7 months after the death of his brothers, he leaves the country. Omar Jallo points out, the migration studies graduate who did the study. Omar points out, fearless of the monsters in the sea that took all his brothers, bewildered about what his journey meant to him and his family, he maintained the incessant desire and the conviction that leaving is desirable and inevitable. Luckily for him, however, he managed to reach France and began a new life, attempting to turn the tides for his family. And interestingly, you can find that in, Facebook. The Phoenix Football Club continues and now organizes an annual memorial football match to remember the victims and, more importantly, to warn about the risks of irregular migration. So these three narratives reflect three key types of migration. The first one is about organized labor migration, often leading to immigration and also integration, and at times opening opportunities, especially for second-generation migrants, while structural discrimination often also remains an issue. The second one, Beata's story, informs us how complex processes of flight, displacement, and refuge are, how complex the itineraries, primarily in the global south, are. And the story also demonstrates the shortcomings of global and European refugee protecting, leading to protracted situation, leaving people in limbo for years and decades. And the last one is about irregular or undocumented migration with its high risks and limited perspectives. But nevertheless, aspirations of young people, of young men, and also to some extent of young women lead people to run the risk. So what I think is very important to understand is that migration processes are complex and that very often dual categorizations or comprehensive typologies do not work. This can be, I guess, best seen in the case of Beata, who was a refugee, who was a displaced person, who was an asylum seeker, who was for some time had proper residence in Germany. Now is now is in a way waiting for a deportation, and so on. So a lot of migration processes, a lot of migration pathways shift between the categories. And it does not really make sense to aim to develop a comprehensive typology. What I also think these stories tell us is that migration is, in all circumstances, still an important resource for individuals and for collectives. The young men from Gambia migrate with their collective in mind. And it is a socially and an economically important resource. Maybe the first story highlights that one. And Beata's story also tells us not only that migration needs resources, but that it is especially knowledge, in this case about European asylum law, that would have, that is very important. If Beata wouldn't have boarded this plane that brought her to Prague in the Czech Republic, if she would have insisted on being on a plane to Germany, her situation would have been rather different. yeah, so the end of the last slide was that migration is dangerous. There is quite a bit of literature on the secularization of migration, because a lot of nation states feel threatened by migrants and refugees. And what I would like to point out here is for those for whom migration is really dangerous, that's the migrants. The IOM counts at least 60,000 people in the last 2 decades who perished along the global migration routes. And they also describe this as an epidemic of crime and abuse. I really thought we should realize this for a moment, that already this year, a year with, due to the pandemic, fewer migrations. Already this year, so far, we've had 1,832 migrants who died along the migration routes. And sure, the Mediterranean is the most dangerous, but sub-Saharan migration follows, and various other places are also very dangerous for migrants. Yeah, so this was a bit of a sketch how we might deconstruct some of the dominant images about global migration. I would like to conclude this presentation by looking at other perspectives from the global south. And so there's very many other dimensions of dominant perspectives in migration studies, and even more so in political and public discourses that we would need to deconstruct. And I would argue, and that's where you all come in, the major means to do so would be to have by far more scholarly perspectives from the global south in migration studies. This would serve to have the existing scholarship from the global south more distributed and more discussed. It would put it much more on the agenda as it is now. And it would lead to scholarship that juxtaposes the methodological nationalism of the global north. And with a medium to long-term perspective, this would lead to a new episteme in migration studies and migration theory. So one of my witnesses for this approach are Josh de Wind and Alejandro Portes, who, this is now a while ago, were looking at international migration studies, and international in this sense meant European and American. And so they explored that and found in this examination of only a few ways in which international scholarship on migration can be fruitfully linked, it becomes clear that doing so requires concepts, frameworks, and methodologies designed for this purpose. But most scholars' disciplinary training is focused on examining migration within single national contexts. This tendency suggests that internationalizing the field of migration studies so that scholars can collaborate more fully in refining concepts or advancing theoretical explanations will in the future require a different kind of training and a more explicitly comparative intellectual stance. So Portes and de Wind were still talking from a global north perspective. And I would like, towards the end of my presentation, I would like to highlight that, we could look at publications, at textbooks and journals and so on, and identify, yes, it is mostly, almost exclusively based in the global north, but also academic training in migration studies is very much happening in the global north. So I've been looking at migration studies master programs that are taught in English, and I found globally 58 programs, and 46 of these are in Europe, respectively, the European higher education area. So there seem to be 2 programs in Australia, and the 2 Asian ones are actually in Israel, and Africa has 3 programs. So I do think what we should call for is to have more migration studies in Asian, and that also means Indian universities. And I would like to highlight now what I think what Indian migration studies is doing in a very interesting way is it's sort of doing away with the standard definition as a migrant. As you can see here with this quote, a migrant is defined as a person who changes his or her country of usual residence. And what since I'm cooperating with the CRG, what I found very interesting and enlightening is that Indian migration studies is very much about what would usually be called internal migration. And I think here we again are at a point where we should do away with the binary definitions. So this is my very last one. I do hope the broad brushstrokes of this presentation have brought the following across. Migration studies scholarship is about the complexity of the lived experiences of migrants in order to question and evaluate policies and to call for change. We have a long way to go to conceptualize and to theorize appropriately, although there is a vast amount of migration studies scholarship originating primarily from the global north, the Western world. And I now allow myself to say we have to deconstruct many preconceived notions, seemingly plausible explanations, and question bodies of knowledge in order to bring in perspectives from the global south. I wish you much success for this, what I think is the endeavor that you are starting, or some of you at least are starting with this course. So this is the end of my presentation, and I apologize for taking a few more minutes, and thank you very much for your attention. And if you like, you can, we'll have a bit of a discussion or question and answers now, but after that you might also send me emails and I'll get back to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Potts. We have to, there are a few questions which I will read out in a little while, but there's something I had to say which I should have mentioned at the beginning, which it was remiss of me to not have mentioned it and glossed it over several times, that we are able to do this online orientation course for college and university teachers is because of the wonderful funders who have been supporting us for quite some time now, especially this orientation course is part of CRG's ongoing research in migration and forced migration studies, which we have been conducting in collaboration with the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung, South Asia, and the Institute of Human Sciences, Vienna, as well as various other universities and institutes in India. So we were very happy to note that from Rosa Luxemburg, South Asia, Pragya Khanna, who has had a very long collaboration with CRG, is here today. So thank you, Pragya, for your continuing support. And if Professor Potts would like to take the questions now, I can read them out to you. Uday Kumar Shaw. Uday's question is, Uday teaches history. We'll learn about him very soon when we have the introduction session. His question is, I want to know how the process of global warming is influencing the migration pattern globally.
Okay. Yes, I think this is another key topic that we need to research. I think we already have quite a bit of such movements, and at this point, I think it's very difficult to foresee what will happen, but even more so, it's difficult. It's important to do research on this. So I do think there is already quite a bit going on various levels in terms of forced migration and so on. And there is some scholarship, but this will be a big task for the future.
Thank you. We have a question from Shudeep Boshu, who asks, is it productive to consider migration from a continental perspective rather than from a global perspective, as in African or Asian migration? And does that have to do with race and territoriality?
I do think that depends on the research question. I do think there is settings where it does actually make a lot of sense to have a continental perspective. For example, to understand the dynamics in South Africa or in Southern Africa. I think for that, it is very important to look at the rest of Africa and so on. But then on the other hand, South Africa would also, depending on what question you want to explore, then it's also important to look at the transcontinental migration, not only of Indians, but also of Malayans and others who contribute to the South African population nowadays. So I would really say we need shifting perspectives.
Okay, the next question is from Kosturi Dotto, who asks you to discuss a bit about the cultural aspects of migration.
So, well, on one hand, I do think that immigration has major dimensions of cultural enrichments in the countries of migration. So that it's most easily seen with food. What we have in Germany nowadays is very different from what we had before we had various migration processes. But that also applies to music, to literature, whatsoever. And I think it matters in most societies, as most societies have become migration societies. And on the other hand, the cultural dimensions also bring a lot of frictions and conflicts and divides. And I think one of the prominent examples for that is, what does the presence of Islam mean I'm again in Western societies now, but all the different discourses we have around that and the conflicts connected to that. So there is no easy answer, but yeah, migration is a process that comes with cultural exchange, but also with cultural conflict.
Thanks. We'll go to the final two questions. Mohana Chatterjee thanks you for the informative lecture and asks you to explain the effects of decolonization on the migration index of the world.
Yeah, so interestingly, decolonization to quite an extent brought African and Asian and also Latin American population groups to the global north. Because in the context of decolonization and the conflicts that were connected to it, quite a number of the colonized people, the soldiers, the administrators, other people connected closely to the colonizing country, then went to Europe, and we have them as communities, as minorities, as ethnic groups in various parts. And as Europe was the main, or was the home of most of the colonizing powers, so that is what happened in that respect. And then we do have various other very complex and multiple developments. This story of Beata that I've been mentioning, Mahmoud Mamdani is the scholar who analyzed the Rwandan genocide and pointed out how the Rwandan genocide is very closely connected to colonialism, and then in that sense also to decolonization. And so we would have to look at the various conflicts and processes of migration and forced migration in order to, decolonization added more layers to the overall processes of colonial migration.
I'm going to read out the comment by Shudip Boshu, but since Shudipta has already had a question, so that we are not going to take that as a question. So the comment is, it is the process and forces of globalization since late 80s and early 90s that were adopted almost by most states in the world, which is responsible for major migration across the globe. We have three further questions, one of which is an explanation of the question that Sriraj had asked about political reasons for migration. So he's explained it that by political reasons, he means that a person leaving the country because some other country or non-state actors have taken over that territory. So how do we study that kind of forced migration?
Again, I don't think there is a special approach or a specific way to deal with these categories. So, for example, the Kurdish population in Turkey, that would be one of those political migrations. And for example, in the 60s, a lot of Kurdish people left Turkey as labor migrants. So that it was a period where they were able to apply for jobs in Germany, and so a disproportionate number of Kurdish people used that pathway to leave the country. And so at that time, it didn't necessarily become clear that they left the country for political reasons. And then they started the communities in Germany, and then we had forms of chain migration, but also claims for political asylum and so on. So, and this is just one of the examples. The Palestinians would be another very complex case with a multitude of migratory movements to a number of states and with very varying results in migration. So I would sort of conceptualize this entire stuff in maybe the establishment or the construction of the nation states and how much that brings in terms of forced migration, immigration, exile, and so on.
Thank you, Professor Potts. There are two more questions, but we have no time. So I've copied them down. I will forward them. I promise to forward them to Professor Potts and also put you in touch with the professor. So thank you. Thank you to RLS and IWM, and we meet tomorrow at 6:30. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.